Have you ever thought that a person can be judged just by their appearance? They can be who they are, what they have done, but just because of a small detail, a wrong prejudice, they can be forgotten. Today's story will make you think about racism, about invisible prejudices that still exist in society without us realizing it. At a high-end restaurant, a man with musical experience, a legend in the jazz world, was rejected because of his plain appearance. But what happened next will make you wonder, do we really see the true values of people, or simply judge them by their appearance? What happens when prejudice leads us to an irreversible mistake? Let's follow this surprising story. And if you want to continue following touching and profound stories about life and social issues, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next videos. On a weekend evening at the Grand Melody restaurant in downtown New York, soft yellow lights reflect on tables covered with pure white tablecloths. The aroma of high-class dishes blends with the scent of expensive wine, creating a luxurious yet cozy space. At the end of the restaurant is a small stage illuminated by soft spotlights, where a jazz band is playing a melodious background music. On the stage, an old piano placed in the corner seems a bit out of place among the surrounding splendor. Customers here are mainly rich and successful people. They chat with each other with gentle laughter, occasionally looking up to enjoy the gentle melodies. As the glass door of the restaurant opened slightly, an old man appeared. Mr. Luther Miles, 75 years old, tall and thin but slightly hunched, white hair hugging his thin face. His old but clean brown suit, worn-out leather shoes, all exuded a simple but elegant look. He slowly walked in, his brown eyes shining under the yellow light, looking around as if searching for something familiar. Mr. Luther was not a regular visitor to places like this. At first glance, he looked like an ordinary old man, probably just passing by and curiously walking in, but his expression was filled with something profound, as if he was holding onto an old memory. His eyes stopped at the old piano in the corner of the stage. It was a piano with a worn black paint, each key discolored by time. His eyes were closed, as if he was reminiscing about the old days, when music was his whole life. It seemed that just by placing his hands on the keys, memories from his youth would flood back. Each note would resonate, telling the story of a quiet but talented artist. He slowly approached the stage, each step slow but sure. Henry Wallace, the restaurant manager, stood near the shrine, a large figure with slicked back hair. He had noticed Mr. Luther's appearance since he entered. Henry did not like guests who looked out of place in this high-class space. He approached and stood in front of the piano, his eyes coldly examining. "Hello, may I help you?" Henry asked, his voice polite but distant. Mr. Luther smiled gently, his voice warm but trembling slightly with old age. "I just wanted to ask, can I try playing some songs on this guitar?" Henry frowned slightly. He looked closely at Luther's old suit and worn-out shoes, then curled his lips into a wry smile. "This is a high-class restaurant, sir. This stage is reserved for invited professional performers only. I'm afraid you can't try your hand here." Mr. Luther bowed his head slightly, showing no sign of dissatisfaction or anger, only responding in a gentle voice. "I understand, thank you." Without another word, he turned around and walked slowly out the door. For a moment, his back looked smaller and more lonely in the splendid space of the restaurant. After he left, the orchestra continued to play soft tunes, and the customers continued to chat as if nothing had happened. But some of the restaurant staff, especially the younger members of the band, had a vague feeling that something was wrong. The image of the old man walking away silently left an indescribable feeling of emptiness. Henry didn't care. He adjusted his tie and continued his management duties with a smug look on his face, as if he had done the right thing to preserve the restaurant's reputation. Little did he know that his refusal would turn out to be the biggest mistake of his life. Not long after Mr. Luther left, the large glass doors of the Grand Melody restaurant opened once more. The quiet space suddenly seemed to stand still as a group of customers walked in. These were not ordinary customers. They were successful businessmen, dressed in impeccably tailored high-end suits, each step exuding nobility and confidence. Leading the way was Richard Thompson, a well-known collector of antique musical instruments. in his mid-60s, with a neat silver mustache and sharp eyes behind thin glasses. Beside him was Elena Martin, a successful businesswoman in the art field, elegantly built, with curly hair framing an elegant face. They were accompanied by two young men, assistants, and longtime jazz lovers. The group of guests walked in confidently, but their faces were filled with anticipation and excitement. They glanced around the restaurant, seemingly searching for someone. When they didn't see what they were looking for, Richard approached the reception desk, smiling politely, but his voice couldn't hide the eagerness. "We'd like to meet Mr. Luther Miles. I hear he's performing here tonight." Henry Wallace stood nearby, momentarily stunned by the name. He immediately walked over, trying to keep his face calm, but his heart was in turmoil. His voice was calm, but a little tense. "Excuse me, who were you referring to?" Richard Thompson frowned, a little surprised by the question. He emphasized, "Luther Miles, the legendary jazz artist. We heard he was going to be here tonight." "How did you not know?" Elena Martin interjected, her voice full of excitement. "He is an icon of classic jazz. I heard him perform in Paris 20 years ago. His tone is truly unforgettable. We have been waiting for this for a long time." Henry felt his heart sink. Luther Miles, the legendary jazz musician? The name sounded strangely familiar, but how could he associate it with the simple old man who had just left the restaurant a few minutes ago? Richard Thompson continued, his voice full of enthusiasm. "He's not just an artist, he's a living legend. In the 70s, he rocked New Orleans with his epic performances. He then toured the world, from Paris to Tokyo to New York. Anyone who loves jazz knows him." One of the young assistants excitedly contributed, "I once heard that every time Mr. Luther touched the keys, the whole audience held their breath. People say he could make even people who knew nothing about jazz cry." Elena added, her eyes sparkling, "I still have his rare recording from 1981. Every time I listen to it, I feel like I'm sitting in a small bar in New Orleans, lost in a world that only he could create." Hearing this, Henry's forehead broke out in beads of sweat. He couldn't hide his confusion. "I'm afraid there may be some mistake. He isn't here." The entire group of VIP guests were surprised. Richard frowned at Henry, his voice a little cold. "Not here? How can that be? He agreed to perform here." Henry stammered, "Actually, there was an old man, but I don't think it was." Immediately, Richard and Elena's eyes hardened. A silence fell over the space. Henry felt as if time had frozen. He suddenly remembered the image of the old man and the old dude walking out the door not long ago, and the terrible truth began to appear before his eyes. He had rejected a living legend. Richard Thompson, with a look of disappointment on his face, turned to Elena, nodding as if signaling her to do something. Elena opened the tablet she always carried with her, quickly searching for a photo. She flipped through a few pages, then stopped at an old, faded but still clear photo, a black and white photo of Luther Miles when he was young. In the photo, he was a man with shiny dark skin, bright eyes, and a charming smile, standing on a large stage under bright lights with a piano beside him. His hair was jet black then, and his face was confident, completely different from the image of the simple man Henry had just rejected. Elena handed the tablet to Henry, her hands shaking slightly as she looked at the screen. Richard, his voice firm but filled with surprise, continued, "This is Luther Miles, the legendary jazz artist. Surely he can't be the man just now." Henry took the tablet and stared at the photo. His eyes widened, his mouth closed in shock. The name Luther Miles suddenly became strangely familiar, like a long-buried memory in his mind. The name was not only a famous artist, but also a jazz icon that he had heard rumors about for years. Henry felt himself freeze. A wave of emotions washed over him, shock, shame, and regret. For a moment, everything around him blurred. The name Luther Miles was not just an artist, but a legend, and he had rejected the man because of his plain appearance. A great sense of guilt rose within Henry, choking him. He tried to say something, but every word seemed to be stuck in his throat. "Oh, it can't be," Henry whispered, his voice trembling. Richard and Elena were still waiting for his reaction, but clearly, their eyes had already begun to shift from disappointment to pity. Elena spoke, her voice cold. It's hard to believe, but it seems like your restaurant missed a huge opportunity. Henry slowly raised his head, looked into Richard's eyes, then back at the photograph of Luther Miles. A feeling of intense regret washed over him. In that moment, he realized that he had just missed a priceless opportunity to witness the talent of a living legend. A feeling of awkwardness began to spread within Henry. Cold sweat began to form on his forehead, even though the temperature in this room was still very comfortable. He began to look around, not knowing what to do, not knowing what to say. Everything seemed to be falling apart before his eyes, as if he had just made an irreparable mistake. Richard and Elena didn't say anything more. They just stood there waiting for Henry to apologize or explain, but even he didn't know what to say. Henry felt like a loser, as if his career, the reputation of this restaurant, were all crumbling before his eyes. He tried to regain his composure, but there was no denying the truth. He had rejected a legend based on his prejudices about appearance, and now he had to face the terrible consequences of that mistake. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but to Henry, it felt like a century. He stood there, his face red with embarrassment, while Richard and Elena silently looked at each other and then back at him. The feeling of disappointment and frustration was clear in their eyes. Elena sighed, shaking her head as if she didn't want to stay there another second. Richard, with a cold expression, finally spoke. "We won't stay much longer. It's not worth it." His words were like a knife stabbing into Henry's heart, leaving him speechless. Instead, Richard turned and walked towards the door, dragging Elena and her assistants with him. The group walked in silence. Not a word of goodbye. Only the steady sound of footsteps echoed in the quiet space of the restaurant. When the group of VIP guests reached the door, Elena paused for a moment, looking towards Henry, her voice unable to hide her disappointment. "We really wish we could meet Mr. Luther. But if this is how your restaurant treats a legend, then we have no reason to come back." Richard also repeated, his voice heavy, "What just happened will be remembered forever. A high-class restaurant like this cannot treat a great artist like that." The VIP group left, leaving Henry and the other staff in a cold space. Every step they took seemed to emphasize the failure of this restaurant in the eyes of music enthusiasts. Within hours, news of the strange incident spread like wildfire among music lovers. Articles and stories began to appear on music forums, jazz groups, and even social media. Pictures of legendary jazz musician Luther Miles and the story of how he was refused a slot at a high-end restaurant quickly became a hot topic. Music critics did not miss the opportunity to criticize the Grand Melody's tactless behavior. Many expressed surprise and disappointment that a famous restaurant could not recognize a great artist like Luther Miles. Luther's fans began sharing the story, emphasizing that this rejection was not only a mistake, but also an insult to his musical legacy. Soon, criticism began to appear in major newspapers. The Grand Melody was not only criticized on music platforms, but also began to lose support from old customers, jazz lovers, and those who used to come here to enjoy the great music space. People who used to come to this restaurant began to realize that, despite being a high-class place, they did not appreciate the true value of art. A huge backlash ensued. Music lovers across New York were talking about the incident, and the Grand Melody became a laughingstock in the eyes of many. Not only did the restaurant lose the chance to have a legend, but it also made itself the target of criticism for its poor judgment. At this moment, in the large room of the Grand Melody, Henry still stood there, his eyes blank, wondering if he could fix his mistake. All that day, he received countless calls from people in the music industry, from partners, from restaurant staff, all wanting to know why he refused a great artist like Luther Miles. The disappointment of the VIP group was only a small part of the problem. The price the restaurant had to pay was not only the loss of face, but also the loss of credibility with a music community that loves and appreciates true artistic values. It didn't take long for the decline in sales and traffic to become apparent. The restaurant, once known for its upscale atmosphere, expensive menu, and great live music, was no longer receiving the same level of support. The nightly jazz performances that had been a major draw were now deserted. Reservations were being canceled at the last minute, and the restaurant was no longer receiving rave reviews from regulars. The Grand Melody, once a warm and welcoming place, was now empty. Loyal customers who loved the restaurant's sophistication began to stay away. They didn't want to return to a place where they felt insulted by unprofessionalism and disrespect for the arts. Negative reviews on platforms like Yelp and Google continued to pour in, further tarnishing the restaurant's public image. The Grand Melody's CEO, Nathaniel Green, was the first to call Henry. Green's voice was filled with anger and frustration. "Henry, I can't believe what I'm hearing. The entire music industry and our community are making fun of this restaurant. We just lost a legend, and it's even made the restaurant look bad in the eyes of everyone. Do you know what the consequences are?" Henry sat in his office holding the phone, but he could not say a word. Mr. Green's every word was like a knife stabbing into his mind, making his regret even deeper. He listened to Mr. Green continue to reproach. "This is an unacceptable mistake. You will have to face the truth. This restaurant will not be able to maintain its reputation if you do not resolve this situation immediately." Feeling ashamed and guilty, Henry could not argue. He could only nod, although he knew that this could not be fixed immediately. A legend like Luther Miles could not return just because of an apology, and the restaurant could not regain its lost image with just a few small efforts. Not only Henry's superiors, but also loyal customers began to express their disappointment. Some of them, who had been regulars at the Grand Melody, contacted to express their dissatisfaction with the way the restaurant treated a great artist like Luther. A longtime customer named Catherine Morris, a music teacher who had hosted many events there, wrote a long letter to Henry. "I was really disappointed to hear that a great artist like Luther Miles was treated like that at your restaurant. I used to be proud to come here, but now I can't be proud of a place like that. I don't think I'll be back." Many others expressed similar sentiments. They felt offended not only by the rejection of an artist like Luther Miles, but also by the restaurant's failure to appreciate true cultural and artistic values. It seemed for music-loving customers, this was an unforgivable insult. The criticism and loss of customers affected not only Henry, but the entire restaurant. The criticism of the Grand Melody continued to spread widely. Despite its efforts, the restaurant was unable to regain its former image and popularity. Jazz performances no longer attracted attention, and the once artsy evenings were now deserted. After leaving the Grand Melody, Luther Miles was in no rush to return to a noisy world or seek attention from the media. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He had been through enough, stood on enough big stages, and received enough admiration from the public. Now he just wanted to return to simple moments, familiar sounds that only he could feel. Luther arrived at his apartment, a quiet place in the old town, not too luxurious, but full of warmth. This small apartment had everything he needed: an old armchair, a small wooden table, and a corner dedicated to the old piano he had brought with him all his years of touring. The piano was no longer new. The keys were worn and its color had faded with time. But for Luther, it was a part of his life, a faithful companion in every performance. Every morning he woke up. Entering the living room, Luther gently dropped his cap on the table, then sat down in front of the piano. His hands trembled slightly as he touched the keys, but even so, each note still resonated with emotion. The sounds from the old piano were not just music, but a vivid memory of a life he had dedicated to jazz, to long nights under the spotlight, and to audiences who loved his music. Luther began to play a piece of music he had composed long ago, a soft, sad yet hopeful melody. Each note sounded like a whisper, a comfort to himself. The old keys emitted a warm sound, as if to reassure him that no matter how life changed, music would always be a place where he could find peace. He didn't need recognition or glory. For him, music wasn't a tool to make a name for himself or attract attention. It was a way for him to connect with the deepest parts of his soul. His notes, soft and flowing, seemed to soothe the wounds left by time and life. The small room was filled with his music. Even without an audience, even without the bright spotlights, with each key he touched, he felt like he was still performing, still sharing his life story with those who truly appreciated it. On the bookshelf near the piano, memorabilia from Luther's travels are still intact. Old photos of him performing at legendary stages around the world, tickets from historic concerts, business cards from friends and musicians he met along the way. Each item, each photo contains its own story, a part of a memory that he cherishes. In the corner of the room, an old suitcase also lay still. That suitcase had been with him through so many cities, so many flights, so many concerts. Luther looked at the suitcase, then back at the piano keys, as if those items were not a souvenir of the past, but an indispensable part of his journey. Luther knows that life may change, there may be inevitable mistakes, but music and these memories will always be inseparable parts of his life. Whether anyone understands or not, he will continue his journey because music is the only place where he can truly be himself. The song ended softly like a wordless farewell. Luther paused, took a deep breath, then stood up and took off his cap. He looked out the window where the city lights began to twinkle in the night. Everything felt peaceful inside him, as if his troubles and trials were just a small part of the long journey he had taken. He did not need to race against time or the crowd. Luther Miles was still a legend. Whether in the dark or in the light, he was always his own artist. In a moment of silence, when all the outside sounds seemed to have died down, Henry began to reflect on his actions. He recalled the scene before, when he rejected Luther Miles, the artist who he saw only as a frail old man in plain clothes, not realizing the aura he had carried all his life. His arrogance at the time, his complacency about his knowledge of the upper class and VIPs, had blinded him to the true nature of the situation. Henry realized that he had been too quick to judge a person by his appearance, too proud of the social stereotypes he had built up over time. And now he had to face the consequences of disrespecting a great artist, a legend in the jazz world. Henry began to wonder if he could change the way he viewed others. Could he learn the lesson of humility that Luther had taught him, even in the most painful way? All he could think about was how he had missed out on an opportunity to meet a great man just because of his plain appearance. The shame came not only from rejecting a legend, but also from his perception of himself as a man who had been too hasty, impatient, and disrespectful to those he deemed unworthy. Henry reflected on an old saying he once heard: "You can never judge a book by its cover." But over the years in the industry, he had forgotten that success is not always measured by fancy suits or expensive cars, but by inner values, talent, passion, and humility. Gradually, Henry realized that respecting everyone, no matter who they were, was the most important thing in his work. He could not continue to live in a world of discrimination and prejudice. An artist like Luther did not need recognition or glory to prove his worth. For him, music was everything, and that was what was worth cherishing. Henry sat quietly in his room, thinking about what he had done and what might have been different if he had treated Luther with respect and humility from the start. He realized that in this world, no one is too small to be despised, no one is too poor to be of no value, and no one is too simple to be a legend. The lesson he learned, painful as it was a valuable one about humility and respect. Henry sighed, a new determination forming in his heart. He knew that he needed to change, not only in the way he viewed others, but also in the way he treated them. He needed to learn to listen, to understand, and especially to learn to respect everyone he met, no matter who they were, where they came from, or what they had. With a sigh of relief, Henry stood up from his desk and headed out the door. He knew that mistakes had been made, but there were opportunities to make things right, and he was determined not to let anyone leave without feeling valued and honored. Each person had a story, and it was his job to see their worth, not their appearance, but their very being. And with this lesson, Henry believes that even though it's late, he can still do better in the future. Time passed, and while the grand melody could not completely repair the damage Henry had done, the event taught him a great lesson. The loyal customers who had loved the restaurant began to return, but they no longer came just for the food or the fancy atmosphere. They came to see that mistakes can be learned and that managers, even in difficult times, can start over. However, the wounds that the restaurant had suffered could not be easily healed. Once again, Henry sat in his office, but this time his mood was different. Instead of the anxiety and pressure of criticism, he felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. The feeling of regret no longer enveloped him, but instead a hope of being able to make things right in the future. One day while Henry was standing at the reception desk, a woman from the previous VIP group suddenly returned to the restaurant. She smiled at Henry and said, "I have heard many people talk about your change. The restaurant is coming back, and it is because you learned from your mistakes." Henry nodded and thanked her. Although he could not go back to the past, he knew that with sincerity and determination, people could regain trust. The restaurant was not a place to show off or deny the past, but a place to share, learn, and appreciate people. Henry had learned that every story, every person deserved respect, not only in music but also in life. As for Luther Miles, he continued his life as before. Despite being a legend in the music world, he did not seek attention or recognition. His small apartment and old piano were still the most important things to him. Every day he sat down at the piano, played a new song, a new melody, and continued his musical journey. Once again, Luther did not know that one person had realized and learned a great lesson from their brief encounter. And although they never met again, what happened at the Grand Melody changed both Henry and Luther in ways that neither could have predicted. Ultimately, in a world full of mistakes and opportunities, Henry realizes that there are lessons that can only be learned through facing failure and making bad decisions. But the important thing is to never give up. Despite the loss and shame he endured, Henry was determined not to let that event define his entire future. Every day he continued to work, working harder and more humbly. The Grand Melody was once a symbol of luxury, but now, under Henry's direction, it has become not only a place to enjoy music, but also a place to honor the values of respect, humility, and love for each person. Life is never easy, and sometimes you have to miss out on a great opportunity to truly appreciate the important things in life. But as Luther has proven through his music, you can always find your way back, even if you have lost your way. And so the story of the Grand Melody and the lessons it brings will continue to be told through the music that resonates in the hearts of everyone, no matter who they are, where they are, or what they have been through.